Welcome to everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to this, our webinar on contrastive analysis, Russian speakers writing in English. I'm Arlyce Menzies. I'm the SSH Writing Center Coordinator here at Nazarbayev University, where all students, staff, and faculty are eligible for one-on-one writing consultations. To find out more of that, please visit our website. And when you go to our website, you'll find more than just our schedule there. You'll find information about writing, whether it be writing about for professional purposes, so for CVs or for motivation letters. You'll also find information for academic writing and writing across the curriculum. So there's lots of stuff there. So you can have a browse. But we're talking today about contrastive analysis and Russian speakers writing in English. Our workshop speaker today is Arlyce Menzies. She is a faculty member in our department in the writing program here at the university. She's been with us since 2018. She has an MFA from Boston University and she's a published poet. So you can read her work in the Baffler and in the New Ohio Review. She knows a thing or two about Russian speakers writing in English because she is taught not only in the United States, but also in Ukraine and Russia. So no doubt she will draw on that experience as she speaks with us today. And just before I turn it over to Arlyce, I wanted to say that while she's speaking, I'm going to be keeping an eye on the chat and the Q&A. So if you have any questions for her while she's speaking, send them through the chat and we'll try to get to them at the end of the webinar. Okay, so I'm going to pass this over to Professor Menzies. Please go ahead.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Lori. And thank you all for coming, or not literally arriving, but paying attention here online. Okay, so we're going to be doing a contrastive analysis, and I'll kind of begin with a little bit of an apology for the fact that an hour or even maybe 6 hours is not enough to talk about this subject. So let me see, I'm switching from Google Slides. How do I?
You could present. Do you want to?
Yes, thank you. How do I do that?
Right hand, and so go to the top right hand corner. It says present.
Okay, our faces are covering. Yes, and I've been using PowerPoint instead of Google Slides. So thanks, Lori. Okay, so we'll be doing a rough, quick kind of contrastive analysis. So the content of today's session is an introduction to what it means when I say intercultural rhetoric. And then we'll look at a model that shows how cultures influence rhetoric, differences between written Russian and English. Again, a little bit rough, maybe a little anecdotal. After those differences, we'll actually look at some samples, including syntax, sentence structure, and passive constructions in Russian and English. And then I'll just give you some quick concluding thoughts. Okay, so intercultural rhetoric. I gave this talk once before and I talked about contrastive rhetoric, which is the early research regarding how culture influences rhetoric. And I shared some of the criticisms of that. So intercultural rhetoric is born out of rethinking what it means to look at cultures, not as stereotypes and not as like essential, but as factors that influence rhetoric. So there are various overlapping in social institutions and practices in a classroom that need to be considered when we study and teach writing in a second language. The holiday model, as adopted by Atkinson, which I'll show you in just a second, helps to emphasize the complexity of culture and underscores the importance of considering interlocking cultures in the writing and communication situation. So that's from Ulla Connor, who wrote about contrastive rhetoric for a new age, more or less. So interacting cultures in education, the reason I kept this model is for you to understand that all writing is communicative. It's all communication. And it happens within a context. So contrastive rhetoric looks at writing in the context of culture, like for example, the culture of Kazakhstan versus the culture of the United States. But here, this is a finer idea, a closer idea of what culture means. Because culture, as I said to one student today, is living. It's not about the past, it's about the rituals and the festivals and the way we honor events in life right now. So your writing, if you're a student at Nazarbayev University or a student in any university, your writing happens within these smaller cultures. So it's not just Kazakhstan, it's the national culture. Then you're interacting with the professional academic culture, the classroom culture, youth culture, and then student culture. And you can kind of see these boxes aren't transparent, so you can't see all the interstices, but you can see that student culture overlaps with all of these things. And the important point about that is that you're writing, as I always say, we all always say in our rhetoric and composition courses, you're writing for an audience and you're writing for a purpose. And your rhetoric serves that audience and that purpose. So topic or subject, audience, and purpose, things you constantly have to consider when you're entering the academic conversation. So this quote is from our core text in the rhetoric and composition course, They Say, I Say. It is true, of course, that critical thinking and writing go deeper than any set of linguistic formulas, requiring that you question assumptions, develop strong claims, offer supporting reasons and evidence, consider opposing arguments, and so on. But these deeper habits of thought cannot be put into practice unless you have a language for expressing them in clear, organized ways. So in the context of these cultures, you have to remember, what does my nationality lend to my writing? What does my professor's culture or my classroom culture add to my writing? Who is my audience there? How am I a member of a youth culture in Kazakhstan? And what do I want to say as a student in this context? So being aware of this rhetorical context is really important for being an excellent writer. And as this quote from Berkenstein and Graf says, I can't give you any formula, any specific linguistic trick or key that will teach you overall to be an excellent writer. It's a matter of understanding these contexts and working within them, recapitulating the expectations of the rhetorical situation that you're in. So from there, let's talk a little more specifically about written Russian and English. So as I said in the opening, this is a little bit anecdotal. And what that means is there are plenty of scientific studies on the corpus of Russian writing and English writing, different, I don't know how to pluralize corpus, corpuses or corpusi of writing. But those studies are a little unreliable. I might say they're interesting, they're anecdotally really interesting, but it's very difficult to get samples of writing that were written for the exact same purpose in a similar context to compare. So it's very difficult to compare two samples that are very similar. But in general, Russian has a greater difference between formal and informal, which you might notice just in simple addresses of your professors. English has much less difference between those two, partly because English happens in cultures that are usually have a lower power distance than countries that are Russian speaking, meaning there's more, I'm not sure how to talk about that other than like the power distance just isn't as great. Information is more democratized and people have access to sort of climbing the hierarchy a lot quicker and easier, perhaps. So the second point is that Russian uses less I, and there's that phrase, ya is the last letter of the alphabet. So there's less personal disclosure, whereas in English, it's sort of a more privileged rhetoric when you can feel the ethos of the speaker and feel the unique, innovative viewpoint or the personal experience of the speaker. That's more valued. It's not seen as biased as often as it might be in Russian. The next point is that Russian is a little flowing, and Robert Kaplan in early contrastive rhetoric said that Russian is much more digressive than English. A lot of Russian speakers would say that Russian is more interesting, more expressive, more like metaphorical, figurative, and therefore maybe decorated than English. Academic writing in English needs to be concise and needs to be directly and cohesively connected with the main point. Like English, you will hear the phrase like, what's the point? What's the point? Because time is very important at least in the US where I'm from, and in many English-speaking contexts. The next point is in Russian, there are more allusions, more conversation with history, which comes from the idea that Russian-speaking cultures are high context cultures, which means that very much is programmed into Russian speakers when, as they're growing up, that an outsider can't really read, like references to popular culture that people from the outside don't have access to, or Soviet culture that people from the outside don't have access to. In English, the meaning is all encoded in the language. So you need very little programming. It's a low context culture and language in general. The final point here on this slide, or in this amount of time that I have to talk about this, is in Russian, there are fewer calls to action. There's more consideration, more turning an idea around and looking at it from different perspectives. And there's fewer expectations of actually changing someone's mind, convincing someone. Whereas in English, especially in business letters written by Russian speakers versus business letters written by English speakers showed many more calls to action, many more demands. So that's another difference. English is a very active, responsible, personal responsibility comes into it. Whereas in Russian, perhaps because of that power difference, there's a little less expectation of making an impact. Also, of course, English capitalism has something to do with that, being a consumer and making demands. So this is just a quick overview. All of you are probably completely aware of English's grammar and how it presents difficulties for Russian speakers. These are just some examples, which in this webinar I won't have time to address, but I would love to address them in further talks, both with my students and perhaps with the Writing Center. So let's begin with some examples. This is the beginning of my contrastive analysis, and I'm looking at sentence structure. So you're probably also aware that in Russian, the syntax is flexible. It changes depending on the meaning or the emphasis, whereas in English, the syntax is fixed. It's subject, verb, object. Russian is a synthetic language, which means that inflection and agglutination show syntactic relationships. So adding parts to a word completely change the word, and the roots are repeated through many, many words, but the part of speech changes by how it's inflected. Whereas English is not completely analytic, but it's a more analytic language, which means there are specific grammatical particles and words instead of inflection. So the syntactical relationships are shown right on the page, which is kind of what I meant by low and high context cultures as well. right in front of you, what's encoded in the language is the meaning, in a way that in Russian it's much more flexible. So take a look at this sentence, single sentence in Russian, and I sort of made it fit in English. So I've highlighted in green the cognates with English. So if you're an English speaker or new to Russian, learning Russian, then you can kind of get an idea of what's being said. But my question to you, you can write in the chat, what is the subject of this sentence? An English speaker would place the subject of the sentence first in most cases. So what is the subject of this sentence?
You can go ahead and type in the chat or the Q&A. There we go. Contrastive rhetoric?
Yes, exactly. So let's take a look at a Google translation of this, which I'll just tell you right now doesn't make sense to me exactly. Analysis of the differences between writing styles and strategies representative of various cultures specializes in linguistics, a contrasting rhetoric derived from a term coined by Kaplan. So not too bad, you get some idea of what's happening in the sentence. But again, this analysis is about syntax. So as an English speaker, the most important, the new information, the information that is being introduced is this term, contrastive rhetoric. So I would place contrastive rhetoric first. Contrastive rhetoric, a term coined by Kaplan, is a branch of linguistics that analyzes the differences between various cultures, writing styles, and strategies. So here you can see Russian puts the new information to be introduced often at the end of the sentence. But English, as I said, we prefer this direct, what's the point, who are we talking about, and what's the verb, subject, verb, object. So this is a good example of how the syntax would definitely change in translation to English. Another example of syntax. And I'd like to ask you, how would you rearrange this sentence to sound more like an English speaker or English writer? People's lives are tightly connected with the concept of stories throughout its whole duration.
So Arlyce, are you asking people to type it out and send it through the chat?
Or let me ask a simpler question so you don't have to type the whole thing. Think about, what is the point of this sentence? What would this argument be about? Would it be about people's lives, because that's the first word in the sentence? Or is there something else in the sentence that is likely the subject? So what is the subject? What should be the subject, and therefore probably close to the front of this sentence?
So we have people saying stories, a concept of stories. Stories.
Great.
Stories. Mm-hmm.
Good, you're brilliant. So this sentence has a couple of problems in the original, and you might have noticed one of them is this pronoun its. What does its refer to? It's a singular pronoun, so it can't refer to lives or stories. So that's a problem. And actually, what it refers to is lives, the duration of a lifetime, or in this case, people's lives, many. So throughout the duration of people's lives, connecting that time modifier directly to the idea of lives, they are tightly connected with stories. So that cleans it up a little bit, but exactly as our brilliant students pointed out, stories is really the subject. So really the argument is in the idea of stories. And my students know this because we've read this same article this semester. So stories are an integral part of our experience throughout our lives. So I'm going to ask you, what else did I do in this sentence that is rhetorically, let's say strategic, rhetorically strategic. I changed something else. Can anyone point out what I changed for the sake of rhetoric?
So we have somebody saying, paraphrasing, you personalized it with us,
Yes,
our.
good job, exactly. I included a first person possessive, plural possessive, our. And okay, since you got it exactly right, is that ethos, pathos, or logos? What am I appealing to? Any answers?
I have pathos.
Okay. Okay, I do like to talk about how rhetorical appeals are usually used in combination. They're usually not appealing to one single either emotion or sense of logic. They're often crossed.
We have all three of them now.
Yeah, okay. So to me, most primarily, our is an appeal to ethos because I'm saying, I'm with you. I believe what you believe. My values are your values. We speak almost with one voice. Like I'm in the in crowd with you. It's stories are integral for all of us. And so that makes me a more credible speaker because it shows that I kind of understand where you are. And this is why politicians say friends and countrymen, or those types of grand phrases that refer directly to the audience, because they're kind of putting their arm around you and saying, I'm like you, which bolsters ethos. But I could make a concession for pathos here because it could be an appeal to our emotional connection with stories as a race, as the human race. So I would say heavy on the ethos, light on the pathos. Okay, moving on. So another example of syntax. And actually I have a something funny to me to say about this once you get it right. But in constructing how we think, patterns in a language can indeed play a causal role. So again, what is the subject? What should be first in the sentence?
Someone says patterns.
Okay,
Another vote for patterns in a language.
great.
Someone says language. Okay.
Okay, good. Yes, language, exactly. Language could begin. Patterns in a language, right? Or language patterns.
Mm-hmm.
That is the best beginning to the sentence. So patterns in a language can indeed play a causal role in constructing how we think. That's much clearer. So the funny thing is, Lori, that I included this slide and I did not cite a source because I took this from a student paper, and I realize now that this is plagiarism. So the original quote is exactly, patterns in a language can indeed play a causal role in constructing how we think. I believe it's Lara Boroditsky, and the student, in an effort to paraphrase, switched the syntax. So I have to tell you all that that is a good strategy. Switching syntax, changing the syntax is a good strategy for paraphrasing and avoiding plagiarism. However, you can't simply switch the syntax of the original phrase. And for more, I posted this to my Moodle, but for more help with paraphrasing, please watch Jeffrey Carney's talk about paraphrasing on the Writing Center web page, because it's excellent and it's really helpful.
That's a good one.
Mm-hmm. Yes, don't do this yourself. Don't simply switch because then your teacher will think this is negative transference from Russian rather than what it is. Okay, so sentence structure. Still more about sentences, not about syntax this time. In Russian, complete sentences may be bicomposite, which means with a subject and a predicate, or monocomposite with either a subject or a predicate consisting of one undivided word. So this I found fascinating about Russian when I started studying Russian and before I really saw student writing. Now that I see student writing, I understand how this gives some transference into English. So English, of course, a complete sentence must have a subject and a finite verb, a verb that is directly, what is that word? Like,
Agrees with the subject?
yes, thank you. Agrees with the subject, exactly. So sometimes the subject can be implied, like in imperatives, open the door, and the subject is you, please open the door, second person. But not like in Russian where you can have a whole sentence with no verb or no subject. I find it really fascinating. So let's look at a couple of examples of how this appears in student writing. So all of us constantly affected by external factors. Can someone give me what is happening here? What's missing? Is the subject missing or the verb missing?
I've got to vote for verb. Another one for verb.
You're right, exactly. So what is the verb?
Someone says to be.
Yes, and conjugated?
Are. Someone's 2 votes for are, 3 votes for are, affected.
Excellent. So exactly right. Most often the verb that is missing is the to be verb. And it often happens when there's something that looks a little like a verb, like this, affected by, but we need this to be. We are all constantly affected by external factors. And so I made one more change to this sentence, which maybe you could have anticipated. External factors like blank, blank, and blank constantly affect who we are, comma, our identities. So again, the actor in the sentence is these external factors. And if you're talking about human life and all of us, you're kind of focused on sort of an existential reality, then you can begin with all of us. But that is very broad. It's much clearer to make an actor and a verb. External factors affect who we are. And you'll notice, I'll get to it if I move fast enough. You'll notice also the difference between a passive construction and an active construction. So I've taken this from we are affected, which is passive, to putting the factors in the driver's seat. Factors affect us, like that, which in English usually makes, especially argumentative academic writing, it makes the writing stronger. So now, still the same subject or the same idea. In Kaplan's article, backs his perspective with pieces of evidence in various angles of time. So what are we missing here, subject or verb?
I have 1 vote for subject.
Yes, and you might have guessed that I would switch from verb to subject, missing, but exactly right. So you also need this important little comma here. Some people think that mechanics are not important. I love them and think they're very important, these commas, and maybe one day we'll do a webinar about the difference of punctuation and mechanics in Russian and English. But here we have, in Kaplan's article, he backs his perspective with evidence from different periods of time. Can anyone tell me how I would like to make this even stronger? Do you have an idea what would make this stronger based on what we've talked about so far?
I have somebody saying Kaplan's article backs his perspective with evidence. Da, da, da.
Okay, that's better. And now the article is doing the work. The article is backing the perspective a little bit stronger.
I have somebody saying delete in.
Okay, same idea. Kaplan's article backs his perspective, but what could I make the subject? Rather than article, what could the subject be?
Someone says the perspective is backed by, so I guess they're going from active to passive voice.
Yes.
We have someone who says evidence. I'm not
Okay.
exactly sure. Evidence, what does that mean?
In Kaplan's article, evidence backs Kaplan's perspective could be. But again, if you think about English as being very driven by this syntactic order of subject, verb, object. So think active voice, subject, verb, object. So the article backs a perspective, sure, but really who's responsible for backing this perspective?
So a number of students are saying Kaplan. So we have like, so Kaplan is the subject for a number of students. Some of them are saying we should precede it within this article, Kaplan.
Okay.
Kaplan.
That's okay. That's great. In this article, but exactly, you got my point, which is Kaplan is the one who is backing his own perspective with evidence. So the evidence does back his perspective, but evidence is kind of an abstract actor. And if you think of English being very subject, verb, object, using strong verbs and placing responsibility on a particular actor, it's much more effective to place the responsibility for gathering evidence and proving a point with evidence on the author himself. So you can begin with in his article, that's great. Kaplan himself, this person, does what? He supports or he backs. I just changed to supports. I don't know why, maybe I shouldn't have done that. Maybe it's confusing, but Kaplan supports his points with evidence from different periods in time. So if you had the second sentence, not bad, not too bad, grammatically beautiful. But if you change the actor to preceding the verb immediately to this syntax of subject, verb, object, then your writing is stronger and much more English, I guess, much more like the privileged rhetoric of English. So great, good job. Now let's talk a little about voice. And Lori, am I fine with time? I love to talk over time.
You're fine. Yeah, it's 5:35.
Okay, thank you. So let's talk about this idea of passive voice. So Russian uses many impersonal, indefinite impersonal, reflexive, and passive constructions. Whereas English, yes, English uses the passive voice. In Russian, you can obscure the subject or kind of bury the subject with perfective verbs and short past participles, imperfective verbs and the reflexive sya, with passive voice itself, and with a null subject with a person and number, they, on the verb and or gender agreement with the referent. So English does that too, but we literally say they like that, like they made me leave the store, and it's the same kind of abstract they, not a definite subject, but it appears in English right there in the words themselves, whereas in Russian it can be more subtle than that because of the inflection. So English uses passive voice, but passive voice is usually constructed with auxiliary verbs to be, to get, and past participle. So I can say, as far as I have seen and the studies that I've looked at, English uses passive voice, especially in academic writing, much more rarely than Russian does. Russian is just full of passive constructions. So I feel like again and again in student papers, I'm addressing passive constructions that would simply be more effective in English if they were put into active. So let's take a look at this one. Ways of thinking and making decisions are formed by the languages we speak. And in this way, our personality is gradually being built. So we have two passive forms here, are formed and being built. So again, this grammatically is fine, but it is not effective grammar in English, especially for making arguments in composition and rhetoric type courses. So how can you change this sentence? Well, let's start with the exact same question. Who is the actor? Who or what is the subject? And then what is the verb? How would you change this?
We have a vote for language. I assume that's the subject, language.
Mm-hmm.
The languages, okay, let me just see if I can read this. The languages we speak form the way we think.
Mm-hmm.
Let me see if I can find another contender here.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the only one.
Okay, that's excellent. Great. So exactly, here we don't have a specific person, and we have this sort of our personality, which actually should be plural. I think I said this grammar is wonderful, but it's not quite, because we each have individual personalities. But yes, exactly right. The languages we speak form ways of thinking, making decisions. And then we have this bit about personality. So the languages we speak inform the way we think and make decisions. And consequently, you can tie this idea of personality back to the languages we speak. They also inform our personalities. Let me see. I think I did not add another sentence to this. But the idea of the personality being built is kind of strange, because we ourselves have something to do with building our personalities. But then, of course, there's circumstance and miracles and accidents that influence our personalities. But that isn't the point. The point here is that language is very important in thinking, in helping us decide, and in making us who we are. So great. Another passive form. Some debatable issues were formulated and both sides were taken into consideration as well as criticized. So I'd like to add to this one that this is incredibly vague. Even if you've explained to me already what the debatable issues were, or what the two sides of the argument were, this sentence is still very washed out, very faded and abstract and vague. So your job here would be not only to change it from a passive construction to active, but also to get rid of these abstract nouns like issues, both sides, taken into consideration is a little vague, criticized doesn't tell exactly what the criticisms were. But okay, so what could be the subject here? Who is acting? Who's the actor? And what's the verb? So subject and verb, please. So we have the passive form, were formulated. Who formulates issues? When you read an article that presents a position, who is formulating the position?
So we have somebody that says discussions could be the subject and somebody that says we could be the subject.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so discussions, some debatable issues were formulated. Okay, still, if you use discussions, it's going to remain passive. And I'm asking you to make it active. So we is a possibility. Like in a classroom discussion, for example, we formulated debatable issues and both sides. We considered both sides and we criticized each side or analyzed each side. So that's a possibility. But if you've just read an article and you're writing about the article, who formulated, yep, go ahead.
We have somebody that says the author.
Yes, okay, great. So some debatable issues were formulated and both sides were taken into consideration. Very often I see the author or this text with no reference to who the author is. So I skipped that step here and I wrote, Fishman addressed the view. Did I skip a slide? No? Okay, so Fishman addressed the view that the language one speaks determines what she thinks, but argued, or he argued, that language influences and even empowers thought. So I've made this very complex in order to get rid of issues, both sides, consideration, criticize, because this previous sentence is so vague. So you could say the author considered both sides, but then you still need to kind of tell what his or her view was. So Fishman addressed this view, but argued his own view. And then that becomes a viable sentence in your writing because it gives a lot of information using subject and the verb addressed, and then he argued for his own position. So I hope that's clear. That was kind of a bigger jump than some of the other ones. Okay, so those are all the examples I have. So I'd like to just conclude with this wonderful quote. Those who know nothing of foreign languages know nothing of their own language. And I would like to extend that a little to rhetoric by saying that when you learn how to operate in a different rhetorical situation, especially now, English, as I said, is not inherently more valuable than Russian rhetoric, but it happens to be the privileged rhetoric. And when you learn to operate in that new context with that new rhetoric, then it gives you tools not just for communicating in an English context, English speaking context or writing context, but also it gives you a greater knowledge of your own language, your own views, and yourself as an academic conversant in the discourse of the university and beyond the university, the wider intellectual community. So my tips are: correct grammar is great, but a successful writer understands the rhetorical conventions of their audiences. So in this case, think about the context, think about the audience and the purpose of your writing, and learn to write excellent Russian rhetoric for that type of audience and purpose, and learn to write excellent English for that type of context and audience and purpose. Then secondly, determine the purpose of your writing and choose the rhetoric that serves that purpose. And I think someone asked me before, maybe in the last webinar, oh, can I get a book on this? And actually a colleague gave me an amazing book. Dr. Heather Mello gave me a book called Russian English, which talks about the legitimacy of Russian English as a version, a form of English. But anyway, I'm sorry, I'm going off on a tangent. My point is, just read widely in your field, read articles in your area of interest. And then, as They Say, I Say book says, put in your oar, like join the conversation, step into the conversation. But the quickest, not quickest, I'm sorry to say, it's a lot of work, but the best way to learn to operate well and recapitulate rhetorical expectations, as I said earlier, is to read English and Russian. And then finally, when you've read and you join the conversation, you yourself are a producer of meaning. And that's really important because we need this intercultural cooperation to solve global problems. So that's an enormous point to end at, but I'll stop there.
Wow, on that note, I mean,
Yes.
yeah, let's all try to solve these global problems through reading. I think that's a
Yeah.
great note to end on. Thank you to everybody for joining us and for contributing to the discussion. Thank you very much for Arlyce Menzies for bringing us all of the information as our workshop speaker. Thank you so much.
Mhm.
And again, as we were saying, the information will be up on the website within a week. Okay,
Great. Thank you all.
thank you.
Thanks, Lori.
Goodbye. Yep.
Bye.